Good evening. For those of you who listen often to my little short shiurim that I've been giving on occasion in the evenings, I wanted to mention I always feel that there's one holiday that ends up being a little bit neglected, at least in terms of our learning and preparation, and that is the holiday of Sukkos. I always find that we spend like a month getting ready for Rosh Hashanah and a focus on Yom Kippur also, and then a whole 10 days to get ready on Yom Kippur, and then all of a sudden, Sukkot is coming very quickly behind that, and we don't really have time to learn ahead. I guess one could argue that Sukkot is a much longer holiday, and perhaps we have time on Sukkot itself to study about Sukkot. But I've always felt, as I said, that we don't have that preparation time for Sukkot as we do for the other Yom Tovim. And actually, years ago, when I was a seventh grade teacher, I used to emphasize my teaching about the Yom Tovim prior to Rosh Hashanah, focused much more on Sukkot than the other ones. I figured they had learned, my students, plenty about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the younger grades. It was about time they spent some serious time studying about Sukkot. Therefore, what I would like to try to do for the next few weeks, up to and maybe including Sukkot, except for next week when I will probably be away, is to spend some time discussing some Sukkot-themed ideas. And one of those is that on Sukkot, at least the custom among Ashkenazim, is to read Koheles, the book of Ecclesiastes. And clearly there's not enough time to go through all 9 chapters, but I want to just at least focus on the 3rd chapter, the beginning of which is well known, and let's see what we can come up with. So, without any further ado, la kol zaman, for everything there is a time. Ve'es lechol chayfetz, and there is a time for every object. Tachas hashamayim, under the heavens. So one of the things that we're going to end up focusing on as we delve into this pasuk is the pasuk uses 2 different words to express time. It spoke about zman and es. And one of the things that we'd like to discover is what is the difference between the 2 of them. So to begin with, I want to share with you an interesting Medrash in the Medrash Rabbah over here on Koheles. Because as we're going to go on to see, the psukim give us 28 different times, 14 positive ones and 14 negative ones, and we'll discuss the symbolism of those as we go on. But the Medrash says as follows: Zman hoyolo la'adam harishon she'ikones legan Eden. It was the time for Adam Arishon to enter into the Garden of Eden. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "Vayanicheu began Eden," and Hashem placed him in Gan Eden. Uzman hayalo sheyetze misham, and subsequently there was a time for him to leave there. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "Vayigaresh es ha'adam," that Hashem kicked Adam out. Zman hayalo lenoach sheikones lateva. It was the appropriate time for Noach to enter into the ark. Shenemar, as Hashem says to him, Bo el hateva, come to the ark. Uzman hayalo lotzes, and there was a time for him to exit. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Tzei min hateva, exit the ark. Zman hayala Avraham she'inose lo hamila. There was a time for Avram Avinu to be circumcised. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "Va'ata es brisi sishmar," you should guard my covenant. Uzman hoya levanav lihimo mehen sheyamulu b'shnei mekomos, and there was a time for his children, his descendants, really, to be circumcised. Achas b'Mitzrayim va'achas b'Midbar. We find that when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim, They all became circumcised, and again in the desert, right before they entered Eretz Yisrael, we find in the Sefer of Yehoshua, Ki mulim hoyu kol ha'am hayotzim. He mentions that all those who had left Mitzrayim had been circumcised, and it was time now to circumcise the rest of the people. Ve'es l'chol chefetz tachas hashemayim, and a time for every object under the heavens. Zman hoya shetinosein haTorah liyisrael. It was the appropriate time for the Torah to be given to the Jewish nation. Amar Rabbi Bevoy, Zman hoya la'oso davar shayinoson l'mayla min hashemayim. It was a time for that thing that had been above the heavens, va'achshav yeh noson l'mata min hashemayim, to now be beneath the heavens. Ve'ezo, what's that thing? HaTorah. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "Vayedaber Elokim es kol hadavar me'ela lemor," and Hashem spoke all of these things to say. So interestingly, I mentioned earlier that we needed to explore the use of the words zman and es in this pasuk to denote time. And if you'll notice, all of these historical events the Medrash put under the word Zman, but the giving of the Torah, it put under the word Es. Why is that? So there's a very interesting piece from the Maharal in Tiferes Yisrael. Tiferes Yisrael is the book written by the Maharal that discusses all aspects of the giving of the Torah and the study of the Torah. And in this discussion of the giving of the Torah, the Maharal brings down this Medrash, which we just read. And first of all, the Maharal says that the fundamental concept that this pasuk, and these psukim, I should say, are coming to teach us is the idea that significant events don't occur by happenstance. It's something that Maharal says in many places, Devarim Gedolim, Einam Ba'im B'mikra. Great events do not happen by happenstance, but rather that Hashem has created and organized the world with great wisdom, something which cannot have occurred by happenstance, and therefore something like Adam Harishon, entering into Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, which was a very seminal event in world history, can't possibly have happened by happenstance. There was a time for it. If it was just something by happenstance, then it would not have had a designated time. Similarly, leaving Gan Eden and the fact that when Adam Harishon left Gan Eden, because of his chet, because of his sin, he brought death into the world. So that was creating a great change in the very fundamentals of the world. A change like that cannot happen by happenstance. The Mabul, the flood, was a destruction of the world. And if bringing the world into existence doesn't happen by happenstance, neither does its destruction. So there's a zman, there's a time for it. Bris Milah, circumcision. Also, there was a designated time from Hashem when mankind should change from being uncircumcised people to at least having a group of people who are circumcised. And the same thing, the time of the giving of the Torah is not something that happened by happenstance, because the Torah is that which gives meaning to existence. An existence which up until then, a world that had no meaning, all of a sudden was now replete with meaning. And that is again a tremendous change to the very fabric of the world. That is not something that occurs by happenstance, and that's why there's a designated time for it. The Maharal finishes off by explaining that most of these things were events that were occurring in the physical world, entering Gan Eden, leaving Gan Eden, destruction of the world, rebuilding the world, circumcising people. These are all physical acts, and that's why they're connected to the word Zman, the word which means time, because any physical act is very connected to and operating under the constraints of time, which define the entire universe. However, when it comes to the giving of the Torah, as we mentioned beforehand, the Medrash labels that under the word ace. Ace means now. Now is an instant. It's not even something that's measurable. It's really just a bridge between then and next. That's now. So now represents something which is not really a measurable period of time. And that's the Torah, which is something which is spiritual and above and beyond any of the strictures and rules of time. Rav Moshe Dovid Valle, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he was a Talmud, a student of the Ramchal, and wrote a fascinating commentary on the entire Tanakh. Actually, on many of the Sfarim of Tanakh, he wrote more than one commentary. Many of them have been published over the last 25 years. And it's a kind of a mixture between Pshat and Kabbalah, his commentary. And so first of all, he points out that the 14 times for good and the 14 times for bad, that's Yad and Yad, two hands. And the two hands combined are what give a person, let's say that so to speak, if we're living in the metaphor, 14 plus 14 is 28, that's koach, that's power and ability. Because the two hands together, that's what gives koach. But as we said, really there are 14 good times and 14 bad times. If those 14 and 14 are separate and they're not supporting one another, they're not blended together, that's when there is the ability for the forces of evil to come and take control and utilize these 14 and 14 times for their own purposes. But when the two of them are connected, like we've discussed other times about chesed and gvura, having to be blended together to create balance. The left is incorporated in the right, and the right is incorporated in the left. That's when we're in a state of tikkun, a state of completion. And in such a state, there is no room for the forces of evil to come along and to do any of their mischief. He also wants to say that the word zman is the same root as hazmana, which is to prepare. It's indicating the fact that in order to receive these 28 times from Hashem, in order to receive the full gamut of experiences that life and God have to offer to you, a person has to prepare himself to make himself into a vessel which is prepared to receive them. In Kabbalistic terms, we call that isarusa de la sata. There has to be an inspiration from below. That's the zman. And then the ace, that's the time when we actually receive them. In the Sefer Rokeach, one of the Rishonim, who wrote an interesting commentary on the Megillos, which is really just B'derech Remez of allusions. So we mentioned the Medrash beforehand. He connects some of the events in the Medrash to the Pasuk as follows. First of all, the Medrash, as you recall, connected Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, to the Pasuk. And he mentions that Moshe was 80 years old when the Torah was given. The first word of the pasuk was lakol, lamed chaf lamed, which has a numerical value of 30 plus 20 plus 30. That's 80, Moshe's age. And also the Torah was given 50 days after we left Egypt, and that's the same numerical value as kol. Still focused on the word kol is chaf and lamed. If you multiply chaf by lamed 20 times 30, that's 600. And that's the age of Noach when the Mabul, the flood, began. Eis l'chol chayfetz, right? A time for every object. So he says either you can see that as an allusion to the future redemption, because the pasuk in Shir Hashirim warns not to awaken the future redemption ad shetechpatz, until it is desired, and it's the same root as the word chayfetz, or the eis l'chol chayfetz, a time for every object, and the object could be an allusion to Torah, about which the pasuk says, v'chol chafatzecha, all of your objects, lo yishvu ba, will not equal to it. And finally, he says, la kol zman. If you take a look at the middle letters, the last word of la kol, the first two letters of zman, backwards, that spells out mazel. Because it is the mazel, it is the celestial forces that have instilled within creation these various times. Thank you very much for listening. Have a very good evening. What do you think?